Outsiders. Good morning. Woohoo! We did it! Yes, welcome to Outsiders, the show that is to woke virtue signalling, racism, hubris, and left-wing identity politics on steroids. What you, mainstream Australia, is to woke virtue signalling, racism, hubris, and left-wing identity politics on steroids. Congratulations, Australia, you made the right call. Congratulations to all of you no volunteers and no voters who got out there. The voice is dead. As I said from day one, this voice thing was a campaign of stealth and deception. Anthony Albanese, you stand condemned as a deceitful and lazy Prime Minister with a useless collection of ministers. You have wasted 18 months of Australians' precious time and hundreds of millions of our precious dollars on this self-indulgent, vainglorious and futile project. You have torn families apart. You have torn workplaces apart. You have sown hatred and division across the nation unlike anything Australia has seen in decades. You and your Prime Ministership are an utter failure. You should resign today, this morning. You were elected on a lie of a $275 cut in electricity prices, and you have delivered the opposite. You and your colleagues are completely out of touch with mainstream Australia. You have wreaked havoc upon us with your hubris and your arrogance at a time of soaring economic hardship. You couldn't even be bothered to read the details of what you wanted to inflict upon us. Australians deserve so much better. Aborigines deserve so much better. Indigenous Australians need jobs and education and freedom from the communist hellholes so many of them are forced to live in. We need full accountability for where the billions of dollars of money given to Indigenous affairs have actually gone. We need to ditch all the fake symbolic nonsense, the welcomes, the treaties, the renaming of our country. Australia needs a new government and a new way of thinking now, and in the not-too-distant future, we look forward to a Prime Minister, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. We have a huge show coming up for you this morning. Lots of surprises. But let's kick it off with one of our very favourite segments, the name of which we borrowed from John Lennon. It's called Outsiders Instant Karma. Watch closely now as some idiot tries to burn the Israeli flag. Who says God doesn't have a sense of humour? Now let's grab the latest Outsiders news. Very special surprise here this morning. We have on the desk with us Bridget McKenzie from the Nationals. Senator Bridget McKenzie, great to have you here with Rita Panahi, with James Morrow and myself, Rowan Dean. Well, what a day. Well, let's kick off, Rita. What do you reckon? You called it from the beginning.
Well, we called it on this program when the polls were at 70% yes. We said, no, once the Australian people see this isn't just about a little bit of harmless symbolism, this is about changing the Constitution in a very impactful way, they said no. And the no is resounding. Every single state, no. Northern Territory, no. In fact, the only place that voted yes is the ACT.
Canberra. Well, let me ask you about that, Bridget. I mean, does this not tell us our federation is broken? We have the people who run every single bureaucracy living in Canberra. So they're the people who voted completely the opposite to the Australian people. Explain.
Well, I can't explain. It's why my political party, the Nationals, want to get public servants out of Canberra, out into the regions and our suburbs where the impact of their decision is really most often felt. So I thought it was a tremendous result on behalf of the Australian people yesterday.
And congratulations, let's say it here once and for all, the Nationals led the way.
Exactly.
You guys went out there when the three of us
popular
on this desk, we were saying, where is the political party that's going to break through this logjam? You guys did it. Congratulations, Bridget. Really, really, James.
Well, and an awful lot of people say that it was that moment that Jacinda Price gave that press conference in the courtyard of Parliament House. I was there for that, and that was the moment, I think, when it really started to hit home that the referendum was going to start losing oxygen, losing altitude very, very quickly. I think it's fascinating now, the wash-up of this here. You know, last night we saw an absolutely petulant, thin-skinned Anthony Albanese, tone deaf, doing what he always does, which is blame other people for his own failings. But it's not...
Namely Sky.
Well, namely Sky. But I want to just go through a few things here. I mean, let's just think about, you know, all of the different ways that he led this campaign to failure. He failed to be across the details of it. He got into this weird fight of denying that the Uluru Statement was actually 26 pages.
Which he was still saying last night.
In fact, we have a clip of him talking about that, I think.
Let's have a quick listen. Here's Anthony Albanese still blaming basically outsiders and Sky News and Peter Credlin in particular for pointing out that the Uluru Statement wasn't one page. No, it was 26 pages, as Megan Davis herself pointed out on numerous occasions. But here he was last night blaming the news media outlet that had brought this to the world, Australia's attention. Have a listen.
We have had a very clear proposition of just two things: recognition and a non-binding advisory committee. But we've had, including in outlets represented in this room, discussions about a whole range of things that were nothing to do with what was on the ballot paper tonight.
Oh, he's angry there. He, of course, blames the news media for doing its job. And, you know, Peter Credlin and myself were two of the only journalists who really pushed this notion from the start that the Uluru Statement was longer. And he denied this. It was absolutely bizarre thing. And then this became this article of faith. But I'll tell you what, I read those 26 pages, and I read all of the minutes of all of the other meetings in that 2017-2018 period from Hobart throughout the entire country. And what was in there was really concerning, because the thing that Albanese did through this whole thing was he pretended that this was not a big thing, just a modest request, but then you dive into it, and it was very big. And from the very start, when he announced this, voice, treaty, truth-telling, whatever that means, and we know what sort of Orwellianism that means, he said this is this much bigger agenda, and Australians weren't going to fall for it, because there's no way that this thing could have no accountability and no power and yet make all the changes. So how's it going to do it? Well, that gap there, that is where 60% of the Australian people said, look, we want great outcomes for Aboriginal Australians, but we do not want to be a country that looks at us differently because of where we come from or how long we've been there.
Yeah, I can't believe this has just been a tremendous outcome on behalf of the Australian people. Australians have voted to stay united rather than accept the division put forward by this arrogant Prime Minister. And I'm just so thankful that Australians in suburbs across Australia, in the regions, got it right. In fact, the only people that were voting yes, Canberrans, and those, you know, very privileged, highly educated Australians in wealthy suburbs.
Well, let's talk about that, Rita. Well,
yeah, this is the divide, where, and this is something I really do hope that the coalition take a lesson from, that their base, their future is no longer in those teal seats, those inner city affluent seats. They're gone, just like they've gone in the UK, the US. The affluent are voting left, but the middle classes, the aspiring classes, those who are wanting a better future for their kids, they're the ones who've been deserted by traditional leftist parties. There was a
fascinating debate last night on Sky on the panel there. Terrific job by Sky last night covering it. It was superb.
There was a bit of sadness.
The key debate there was a bit of sadness. There was also an awful lot of nonsense talked by a couple of the panellists, but I wouldn't dare say which ones. That's up for viewers to choose for themselves. But there was a good debate about the question of what this means for the Albanese government. And as far as I'm concerned, as I was just saying, Albo has no future. He offered nothing except two $75 cuts. He didn't deliver those. There's nothing else there. He's completely out of touch, Bridget, with the Australian electorate.
Absolutely, and he showed it once again. Whilst people are struggling to pay their mortgages, struggling to pay their energy bills, worrying how they're going to pay for the kids' sporting fees, given how the family budget's looking, this guy is running around in a Yes T-shirt instead of actually dealing with their everyday concerns. And they felt left behind by him.
But one of the most interesting bits of analysis that's come out from the political pundits, and it's not just at the ABC and The Guardian, you hear it elsewhere, is this just genius sort of analysis that Peter Dutton defeating this referendum, well, this is actually terrible for him. This is really going to be...
That's the spin that's coming.
That was the comedy. That was the comedy stuff I was referring to.
This is just going to be the end of his any aspirations he have to be Prime Minister. What's your response to the political pundits who are pushing this quite strongly?
Well, you have to completely reject it. I mean, at every step of the way, Peter Dutton, as leader of the Liberal Party and obviously the coalition, we came out with our position as the Nats. He has led, I think, a really good process for the Liberal Party. He wrote to the Prime Minister with legitimate and sensible questions in January. Still no response. Australians were going to the polls yesterday wanting answers to those questions, offering to, let's just carve out the recognition piece of the referendum question, leave the voice for another day, like the Karma Langton report suggested. Again, refused by this incredibly arrogant Prime Minister. So I think Dutt's got the tone right. And even last night, doubling down on our efforts to address closing the gap for our vulnerable Indigenous Australians, tick. That's what everyone wants.
I love the fact, sorry, just quickly, James, I love the fact that his speech last night was a great political speech as well.
It unified.
And it unified and he said, here's the way forward, James.
But I mean, you want to talk about unification versus division. I was absolutely fascinated by this statement that the Yes 23, or the Indigenous Australians who supported The Voice, put out, calling for a week of silence and mourning and grieving for this. But you know, this statement here is really important to dive into, because it underscores exactly what people were so nervous about. They put it all on the table. They said, this is a bitter irony that people who have only been on this continent for 235 years would refuse to recognize those whose home this land has been for 60,000 and more years is beyond reason. This is what
That's the nub of it.
This is the nub of it.
Absolutely.
This was saying to everybody in this country who arrived, you know, from the First Fleet on, that you are a guest here. And this is why this started, by the way, remember when Marcia Langton said, well, you know, if you vote no, you'll never get another welcome country. We're going to hold you to that, Professor, by the way.
Thank goodness, Marsha.
And everybody say,
let's agree here now. Can please all of us, 60% of Australians, please agree, no more welcomes except on very special and rare occasions, and no more acknowledgements. That stuff's got to go. Corporate Australia, you all got it wrong, corporate Australia. All the major companies that we, the Australian people, 60% of us, keep you in jobs, keep you in your boardroom seats, and you betrayed us because you got us wrong. So you board members and you CEOs, change your tune, stop virtue signalling, listen to the people of Australia, and we want no more of this stuff. When I land on an aeroplane, I don't want to hear all about your welcome virtue signalling stuff. It's got to stop, and can we please stop renaming everywhere around Australia with some sign, some language that none of us know? It's got to stop. Australia has spoken. Now can we put a stop to it? Sorry, Bridget.
It's okay. I completely agree about the crony capitalism that's been going on in this hand-in-glove relationship between corporate Australia, the elites, not just the highly educated and privileged wealthy, but also our sporting heroes, our celebrities, our corporate elites, all wanting to tell Australians how to think and what to do, and silent majority en masse quietly walked into polling booths around the country. Kind and generous Australians walked in and said, we are kind and generous. We are not racist.
Exactly.
We want reconciliation, but we do not agree with you, Prime Minister.
Exactly.
And,
sorry, just quickly, Rita, I want to play you this clip from Dean Parkin last night. Now, going on what James was saying, the response there from the Marshall Langtons and Noel Pearsons is bitter and twisted. Now let's have a listen to Dean Parkin speaking last night.
We did all we could to ensure that the proposal was strong, but it is clear from the result that we were not able to reach you through that, and we were not able to reach you and cut through what has been the single largest misinformation campaign that this country has ever seen.
Rita?
The chutzpah in that statement, the gaslighting in that statement, the misinformation, the lies came overwhelmingly from the Yes camp, which was also had the advantage of being cashed up, having all these resources that the No camp didn't have. It was never an equal fight. And now, I mean, it is just so bitter and twisted to blame misinformation rather than acknowledge that, no, Australians looked at what you were offering and rejected it. In fact, the latest poll that came out, the YouGov poll, showed those who had read the Uluru Statement were more likely to vote no than those who hadn't.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, you know, we are going to now see what I keep calling a tantrum of the elites. We are going to see a tantrum of the elites in this country where they seek to blame everybody, including people sitting at this desk, for the failure of a proposition that was doomed to fail because of their own hubris. And we'll talk about misinformation. Here's a very brief list of misinformation that they put out. They put out that 80% of Indigenous people supported The Voice. Wrong. 59%. They put out that it was a modest proposal. It is not. They said that the Uluru Statement was only one page. Not true. They said that it wasn't about voice, treaty, and truth-telling. It is. They said that it wasn't about reparations or co-sovereignty or anything like that. When you read what the people like Megan Davis write in their academic papers, they all talk about this being the step to these other governance arrangements. That's all misinformation. And yet what is going to happen now? Well, the government is going to go and they're going to try and push this misinformation bill through Parliament, which is going to attempt to silence voices who question their agenda.
So,
it is
Bridget,
sinister stuff right out of Orwell.
James is 100% correct.
Yeah.
They're already saying, oh, it was all because of misinformation. What are the Nats and the Libs doing to stop this ACMA misinformation, disinformation bill? Because don't forget, the last Liberal government had a similar misinformation thing that they were putting up, that Paul Fletcher character. Forget him. What are you going to do to guarantee that the Libs will and the Nats will oppose this misinformation in every and stop it?
Outsiders across the country, good Conservative people, we are absolutely opposing the misinformation bill. No ifs, no buts.
But will it get through the Senate?
Well, this is the problem. I mean, you have the likes of Lydia Thorpe, you have the likes of David Pocock, who don't hold those same values, who can be swayed around wanting to be kind and generous to people.
But just spell out the danger of this bill from your point of view.
Well, I think to James's point, it absolutely potentially silences, like we saw on booths today, genuine Australians through this whole campaign who had concerns about the proposal of The Voice, felt unable to mention it at dinner parties, at barbecues, at the school drop-off and pick-up, because they feared being called stupid, racist, D-heads and dinosaurs and the rest of it, right? But we should be in a country where you can have those discussions and debates respectfully and then, in a democracy, exercise your vote.
And Bridget, I want to ask you too.
But that relies on freedom of speech.
So it's great, and I know that David Coleman is leading that charge as a Shadow Communications Minister. I've had many conversations with him about that. But then now, what next for the coalition when it comes to Indigenous Australians? And so is the next push really going to be pushing for those audits that we're talking about? Is it going to be about performance-based aid and grants, about, you know, making sure that there's real accountability? Because I think the thing that people are uncomfortable about too is that there's so much money that goes out and there seems to be so little accountability around it. Bridget?
Exactly. And we're pushing for the audit. For too long, both sides of politics have pushed money out the door. Some programs work in some places, lots don't. And rather than saying you don't get to keep that money, we're taking that off and putting it into the programs that do, A, we're not measuring it properly, and B, we haven't had the courage to take the money away and put it in where it's working. I think this will allow this. Also, we want a royal commission into the sexual abuse of Indigenous
100%, 100%. Now,
and just we call on the Labor Party, who have been silent. We've been calling for that for months. The Prime Minister last night, in a show of unity, could have actually said he'd take up that offer in a bipartisan way. Instead, he's still looking for answers.
How you could not back that? I mean, how you could not back an inquiry into the most vulnerable, disadvantaged members of our country? is beyond me. It would be just pure politics to deny that, because we know it's needed. Anyone who has any interest in this area knows how grim the problem is and that it needs far more attention. But the activists, you know, they want to talk about changing Australia Day. They want to talk about changing the flag. They want to virtue signal about this and that. But when it actually comes to consequential issues, people's lives, young kids, no, they're not interested in those. Well, speaking of,
just very, very quickly, Bridget, before we lose you, you know, so-called protest Palestinian activism will be happening in Sydney, or there will be marches or whatever today. What's the position of yourself and the Nats on what is happening here in Australia with law and order, with these anti-Israeli sentiments?
Well, I was at Shabbat in Melbourne, a community Shabbat with thousands of not just Israeli and Jewish Australians, but supporters right across our community, standing united with Israel now and always. I'm a proud Zionist and I'm not ashamed to say so. I think the New South Wales government and state governments around this country need to get serious about protecting those who share those sentiments, like our Jewish community. And if there are people in our Australian community who want to shout things like "gas the Jews," then they should be prosecuted by the police quick smart. And I just don't have any truck with it. And it's really up. You can't hide. The New South Wales Police, the Victorian Police need to get serious about prosecuting these people and saying we have zero tolerance about it. It's not about the Premier saying don't have a protest. It's about the police locking these people up and saying this is not acceptable, it's not Australian values. And the Labor Party, we had a Prime Minister who couldn't get his Yes T-shirt off for 4 days to get into a synagogue and stand united with our Jewish community. It was unconscionable. And if it wasn't for Bill Shorten, I don't think he would have.
Bridget McKenzie, always great to have you here on the show with us. Thanks so much. And we'll see you soon. Plenty more to come, including the latest from Israel, plus the bloke who was arrested, Mark Spiro, at one of those rallies, coming here in a second. Rita's reality check too, all on Outsiders. Don't go away.
Welcome back to Outsiders with your hosts, Rowan Dean, James Morrow, and I'm Rita Panahi. Coming up, we'll be crossing to Tel Aviv to speak with former British commander about what we can expect to see next in Israel. But first, can I just take a minute to say, well done, Australia. What a resounding victory, a triumph of the common man and common sense over the powerful elite who think they can bully us into submission. And my word, haven't we already seen the glimpses of an almighty mass meltdown among the left? I'll have a few examples of that for you shortly. And yes, Magda does make an appearance. The referendum result was a proud moment for the Australian people who withstood an ugly and well-funded campaign of intimidation, a deeply dishonest and unrelenting campaign to guilt us into backing constitutional change that was racist and offensive in principle and would have been costly with far-reaching consequences if it were ever put into practice. And as we all know, anyone who read the Uluru Statement, anyone who has listened to the authors of the statement make extensive comments over the years about how the voice would empower them to negotiate a treaty from a position of strength, even the Prime Minister had pledged to deliver the full Uluru Statement, voice, truth-telling and treaty. A treaty with our own people. A treaty is something that two nations make with each other. That's partly why the left has stolen that fallacious political term from Canada, First Nations. We've never used that term for the Indigenous community until like 5 minutes ago. The Australian people overwhelmingly rejected the divisive racial politics of the left. They rejected the plan to give the activist class even more power and funding. They rejected the notion of listening to the same powerful voices that have delivered such appalling outcomes for their community. Now it's time to deliver some accountability. Before the Prime Minister hoisted this divisive debate on the nation, many were unaware of what was happening in this sector, the land claims, the Aboriginal heritage laws, the billions spent on closing the gap and failing. What we need now is some measure of accountability, and that's precisely what Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price is pushing for. This lie that the Indigenous people do not have a voice or an advisory body, well, it's just pure nonsense. We have dozens of such advisory bodies already at both state and federal level giving advice on policy development, including the Coalition of Peaks, which represents more than 80 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled peak and member organisations. We've got the National Indigenous Australian Agency alone. That's got 1,300 employees and a multi-million-dollar budget. And let's take a quick look. This is interesting. Look at the 5 seats with the biggest Indigenous population and how they voted. Now, Lingiari in the Northern Territory, 58% no. They have an Indigenous MP representing them, but they voted no. Durack in WA is 73% no. Leichhardt in Queensland, 67%. Parkes in New South Wales, 79%. And Kennedy in Queensland, 81% no. You may have the affluent Teal seats where people are about as far removed from these issues as humanly possible voting yes, yes in small majorities. But in the seats where Indigenous people actually live, the results are a resounding no. That should tell you something. Now to what you've been waiting for, the yes camp and the mass meltdown we are seeing from our privileged lefties, from Australian cricketers needing counselling to deal with democracy. I don't know, maybe they should go back to taking a knee. That seemed to bring the nation together. And the meltdown is also impacting celebrities, media and political pundits who are emoting wildly all over the internet today. Let's hear from the contributing editor of The Monthly, Rachel Withers, who has this sober analysis. Based on what we are seeing, no will be a victory for racism and conspiracy theories, for neo-Nazis and eugenics. Oh, my God. Confirming for Peter Dutton that misinformation works. The ABC's Jonathan Green posted this considered remark. F Australia? I mean, seriously? What the F? How can you say no? Writer and TV producer Cara Schleck offered this charming take. F today, F this country, saying no to First Nations recognition on the same day we enabled the ethnic cleansing of an entire people. I have never felt more ashamed to be Australian. Oh, of course you are, love. I do wonder what the Venn diagram of those who are anti-Israel and pro-voice looks like. I don't know, maybe Kamala can help us figure that one out.
I think we know.
Now, alleged comic Magda Szubanski offered this to all our beautiful First Nations people. My heart goes out to you tonight. I wish this had been different. Please know that there are millions of us who love and treasure and support you, that we hear your voice and we will continue to walk with you. Broken heart emoji. Thank you emoji. More emojis. That sounds a lot like Magda telling Indigenous folk that only those who voted yes support them. How very unifying. And let's end with the ABCs and the Australians, Philip Adams, who can always be relied upon to be the adult in the room. He wrote, LNP announces a piano with only white keys.
Very clever.
Okay, maybe not. Those who want to use this result to paint Australia as racist and unsympathetic to the Indigenous community should be ignored. They are not serious people. They do not act in good faith. They're the same destructive activist class who relentlessly push far-left agendas no matter what. Ignore them and be proud of a country that voted for equality.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rita. And that Venn diagram as well between ABC presenters and people completely out of touch with the rest of us. Australia is worth looking at as well. Let's, defund the ABC. Now, our next guest was arrested in Sydney on Monday night. Arrested. Why would he be arrested in Sydney on a Monday night? What had he been doing wrong? Well, he'd been holding an Israeli flag near a memorial to commemorate the appalling murder, rape, mutilation and deaths of Israeli women, babies and civilians in the Negev desert. For that, he was arrested. Oh, yes, there was a massive, aggressive pro-Palestinian rally just nearby. Have a look.
What's he been arrested for?
I've done nothing wrong.
Tell us what he's being arrested for.
What have I done? Just tell me what I've done. Stop.
Why is he?
So Mark Spiro joins us in the studio. Mark, terrific arrest there, one to show the grandkids. So tell us, you were holding your Israeli flag, you were going down to the Opera House to commemorate, I mean, we laugh, but you were commemorating a very serious event, a horrific event, yet you were arrested. What happened?
Yeah, I think everyone knows what happened. To this day, I was the only one arrested on the Monday evening, not 36 hours after what was the biggest massacre that the Jewish people have faced since Nazi Europe. And yet I was the only one arrested. I can't get those images out of my head of somewhat a couple of hours after my arrest where these same people were burning the Israeli flag, were chanting, as we all know, Gaza Jews, F the Jews. And you have this image of tens of our New South Wales police force on the steps of the Opera House just watching and allowing racial incitement to take place at one of the most iconic buildings in the world.
And at one of the iconic buildings, on the night where it was lit up in the colours of the Israeli flag, to a moment for the community to pay respects to those who had fallen, there were no Jews there. Jews were told to stay away from our most iconic landmark.
Yes. I think people need to appreciate that words have meaning. And any student of history will know that chants like we heard on the Monday evening have no place anywhere. I find it absolutely shameful. And I can tell you there is a community in this country that is really hurt by what was said. It's actually it's been a very confronting week.
James. And Mark, I mean, I want to go through what actually happened when you were detained by the police. You told me when we've spoken before that the police said that they were doing this for their safety because they didn't want a confrontation. What does this tell you about a police force and a police minister who's behind all of this, who's giving orders not to enforce the law? Because down at the Opera House, they were setting off flares, which is also against the law. No arrests were made for that. But that instead is about preventing physical conflict. Are you worried that under this government, and especially this police minister, thugs with the force of numbers are able to defy the police and the police won't do anything because, well, safety?
Absolutely. I think we all should be worried. If our own police force is worried about their own safety and has to use me, an innocent bystander with a rolled up flag as an example of that, and I don't know if you've seen other people that were, I'd say we're not pro anything. We're anti a terrorist organisation that not 36 hours before has brutally massacred hundreds, thousands of people. I mean, let's put some numbers around that for a second, right? That we're talking about the equivalency on a per capita basis of 70,000 Americans. Our own police force are afraid. Our own police minister refers to the Jewish community as your people in her instruction or
seriously
in her advice not to go into the city.
What's the emotion amongst, I mean, obviously you can't speak for all Jews in Australia, but what, from your friends and community and others, what's the emotion at the moment?
One of fear. I was with some friends last night, hosting some other people that unfortunately have to go and protect Israel and are waiting for flights. And we're thinking about where we can go out in Sydney that is safe.
And you would have seen that video that went around of some Jewish teenagers with an Israeli flag who were being confronted. I mean, and yet it feels to me like the government is almost sort of saying, well, don't show yourself. This seems to me greatly, you know, that somehow they're the ones who are causing the trouble. What do you say to that?
I've also seen images of pro-Nazis walking through Flinders Street Station in Melbourne with masks and chanting Hail Hitler and asking if people are Jewish. Happened a few days ago.
Yeah.
I've seen synagogues yesterday have to go into lockdown for periods of time because there are concerns that there's a potential gunman on the loose in the eastern suburbs.
Well, that's a natural extension. If you with a flag is going to be not acceptable, it's going to rile up people, then what if you've got a Star of David or if you've got a skull cap? Is that going to be the next thing, that you're going to have to hide your Jewishness in public? Otherwise, you're going to incite people? I mean, that's a scary thought. And we know in France, a lot of the Jews who left France said they were forced to do that. They had to hide their Jewishness because it was so hostile.
We keep hearing from even the left that never again. And yet we see what happened 80 years ago happening again. That Jewish children are afraid to wear the items that you've just referred to. In fact, I'm highly encouraged by the thousands of people since the incident on Monday evening that have come out and said I've instilled more pride in them. Right?
Well, you made the cover of the Spectator Australia this week, so there's a cartoon there and it says you're saying to the police, "What is my crime?" And the police are saying, "You're Jewish." And that's the reality. That's what it's come to, that it's a crime to be Jewish in this country. What has been in the last couple of days? Have you had any kind of official response, apologies to you directly? And also, there's a demonstration today. What do you make of that? What's your advice for that?
So firstly, there's been no apology. And there's been invitations to apologise to me personally in Parliament on Thursday, which Police Minister Catley refused over and over again. And as for my response to your last question around what potentially might happen today, the fact that 1,000 police funded by the taxpayer have to stand and protect the citizens of New South Wales today from something that might get out of hand is unfathomable. But what are they standing for?
Because precisely, they're standing for the murder of Jews near the Gaza Strip. That's what they're standing for. They're saying we support the appalling atrocities that we saw. That's what they appear to be supporting.
We are giving
Hamas is no different to ISIS. They are supporting the beheading of babies. They are supporting the most appalling rape and torture, mutilation of women, children. That's what they're supporting if they are standing there and criticising Israel at this point in time. You cannot de-link the two things.
There's no moral equivalency.
Mark, what does it say to you that, you have to have police standing to protect, on one direction when you've got the people who are protesting essentially in support of Hamas, and then the other night there was a big show of support in the eastern suburbs, in Dover Heights, I believe, and yet the police had to protect them from other demonstrators, that there had to be so much security. I mean, that just sort of says it all. And what do you think now needs to happen with the state government? Certainly Yasmin Catley has to go, I presume, the police minister, but are you satisfied with the way Chris Minns, the Premier in New South Wales, has handled this issue?
Look, I'll answer the first question first. I think the police minister absolutely has to resign from her position based on what we saw on Monday evening. There were laws that were broken. There's anti-incitement laws, there's defamation laws, there's anti-racism laws, there's anti-Nazi laws.
Anti-flare laws?
Anti-flare laws that I'm not familiar with, but I'll take your word.
You're not allowed to set off flares in the middle of the city. Yeah.
We put people away. Let's take another step back. We put people in this country away for child abuse, for rape, and yet we are giving people a stage to celebrate those very acts. It doesn't make sense. Right? As to your next question, and you mentioned Wednesday night solidarity rally, you can compare and contrast, if you will, I'll leave that to the public, how the Jewish community conducted themselves on Wednesday in a very dignified way, mourning and showing empathy to the atrocities that took place. It is, in terms of Premier Minns, I think he actually has come a long way. I will say this, that he has apologised to the Jewish community. He spoke particularly well on the Wednesday evening, I found. And the next step that he could, take to really show that he is taking this seriously is to have a good hard look at his police minister in his cabinet.
Mike Spiro, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders. Hope to see you with your flag somewhere around town at some point without being arrested.
If I'm allowed.
Thanks so much. Up next, we're going to talk to Richard Kemp about what is going to happen in Gaza over the next few hours. In a tick. You're watching Outsiders with Rita Panahi, with James Morrow and myself, Rowan Dean. And thank you so much for watching us every Sunday morning. And thank you so much for being with us over the last 18 months. This show was right from day one opposing The Voice on principle, ahead of virtually everybody else. And I'm proud that we were. Let's talk a little bit about New Zealand. Another great bit of news, the Jacinda Ardern, disastrous left-wing government. She scurried off for cover when she realised that they would lose this election. They did lose. We've now got an airline CEO, heaven help us, not another one. He's now the Prime Minister. So congratulations to them. Apparently the ACT party, ACT, are in coalition with the Nationals, and this will, James, be a positive result for Conservatives, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, but Conservatives in New Zealand is sort of a wishy-washy sort of thing.
On there,
I mean, but I was just really interesting because I was just reading some of the CNN coverage of it, and it's a move to the right for New Zealand, and Jacinda Ardern was lovely, but people didn't like her lockdowns because they were vicious, terrible right-wingers, and so it's fun watching a bit of the meltdown happening over that.
Certainly a shift to the centre-right. There's no denying it. It was a resounding loss. There will have to be a coalition with the Nationals. It could be the ACT, it could be Winston Peters, who, remember, spectacularly installed Jacinda Ardern in the first place. But he's been staunchly against the race-based laws in New Zealand.
Well, this is interesting, Rita, because it is very similar. So we've had this, basically, the Maoris were doing what the First Nations here were doing. It was a co-governance thing that was being implemented in New Zealand.
And Rowan, it was
treaties, et cetera, et cetera.
It was a great warning too, and I think a lot of Australians who were keyed into what was going on in New Zealand understood. And when they saw things like the reform around the Three Waters legislation and things like that, the way that once resources and things like that start to get racialized, there's all sorts of corruption in New Zealand over this sort of thing, misgovernance and divisiveness. And so, people look at that and they say, no, we don't want to go down that racialized path where, I think the thing about The Voice being defeated is that it means that if The Voice had gotten up, race would have been put front and center in Australian life. And we look at New Zealand, we look at America with Black Lives Matter, we say we don't want that here.
No, and in New Zealand, I mean, that strategy was straight down to hospital beds. We had surgeons coming out saying they're getting advice that they have to prioritise patients. One of the things they will be prioritising on is their ancestry,
exactly.
Not how much need they have. I think that's just crazy.
Exactly. Well, let's hope that the Nationals government are not a bedwetting government. Let's see a bit of spine there, and let's see if they can overturn some of the madness of the Ardern years. Joining us now, the latest. Let's catch up on the latest from Israel. He's over there. He was with us last week from London. Now he is in Israel itself. 8 days since Hamas's brutal surprise attack, and the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, have begun their offensive in their mission to save the hostages and to basically put an end to Hamas, which is like putting an end to ISIS. British Commander Richard Kemp, Colonel, how are you? What's happening in Tel Aviv? When are they going to attack, or have the attacks already started?
I'm very well, thank you, Rowan. I hope you and your team are there as well, and of course all your viewers down under. I've been up in the north today in on the border with Lebanon, where it's beginning to hot up there as well, and Hezbollah have attempted infiltrations today in the place I was, and also firing rockets. The IDF have got a very close eye on what's going on there, because it may well be that they're forced into a two-front war. And that, of course, is why the US have put aircraft carriers up in the eastern Mediterranean to deter Hezbollah from attacking from the north. But down in Gaza, I was there yesterday as well on the Gaza border. And again, things are intensifying there. The IDF have begun obviously a number of days ago, began their air attacks against Hamas terrorists. They carried out a couple of short, sharp raids into Gaza with tanks and infantry the day before yesterday. And they're gearing up on the border to perhaps launch a large-scale ground offensive into Gaza. And I was talking to some soldiers down there who are ready to go. They're a bit apprehensive, of course, as every soldier would be in that situation. They're going to face a tough fight if they go in, but they're also ready to go in to prevent Hamas from firing rockets, continuing to fire rockets into Israel, and, of course, from repeating the horrific slaughter that took place last weekend.
James.
Colonel Kemp, I mean, obviously the prospect of going into Gaza and doing a block-by-block clearance of Hamas from there is a terrifying prospect in some ways. But you mentioned the U.S. And their aircraft carrier and putting in, you know, their influence to try and keep things from developing worse. But what is the U.S. doing when they're putting an aircraft carrier in the Eastern Med on the one hand and yet still not doing anything about Iran, which is the real cause of all of Hamas's strength and power, and not even clawing back the $6 billion in funds that they released to them? I mean, isn't the Biden administration being really two-faced about this?
Well, actually, unless I'm wrong, I believe they have reversed the decision to release the $6 billion of funds to Iran as a direct result of this operation. I certainly was, that was my understanding. So yes, but I mean, I think Biden helped to provoke this situation by effectively appeasing Iran. And of course, Iran is right behind this war. They funded Hamas, they armed Hamas, Islamic Jihad as well, and Hezbollah. And they were given encouragement and strength by US appeasement. But I think the US so far have been pretty much four square behind Israel on this occasion. But of course, you're absolutely right that Iran has to be dealt with. It's not just a question of withholding those funds, if that's what's happened, but it's a question of I believe, taking distinct action against Iran, whether it's during the course of this conflict or later.
Rita.
What has become of the hostages? There were reports that there were some hostages who were found dead in Gaza, but there was over 100 taken. What do we know about efforts to find them?
Yeah, there's about 120 or thereabouts. I'm not sure anyone's got an exact figure of hostages, men, women, children, babies, old people, taken, dragged across the border, sometimes by the hair. And when they got into Gaza, in many cases, they were spat at and abused by jubilant crowds coming out onto the street to celebrate Hamas's victory. Nobody knows where they are. Well, the IDF is clearly working on that. That's one of their top priorities, IDF and Israeli intelligence, trying to establish exactly where they are. Now, the likelihood is they're going to be dispersed in a number of locations. And the likelihood is they're going to have a gun to their head as well, so that if the IDF do locate them and attempt a rescue operation, they're going to be the first to die. Let's hope they can get all or at least some of them out of there, but it's a very tough ask. And you mentioned bodies having recovered. The IDF, in the raids they carried out on Friday across the border into Gaza, they recovered some bodies of people that have been taken across from Israel into the Gaza Strip.
So, Richard, we've only got a minute left, but just tell us, what are the big dangers? Obviously, booby traps. How do the IDF, what are the soldiers you've spoken to, what are the big challenges logistically of getting into Gaza? Will they find anyone? 1 million people are being told to leave. What are all the logistics they have to deal with, Richard?
Well, as you rightly say, ambushes, booby traps, snipers, ambush positions. There's going to be, the whole place is crisscrossed with attack tunnels so that the terrorists can get into the tunnels and then get behind advancing IDF forces and attack them from behind. It's a very, very tough situation, particularly if and when they get into the cities inside Gaza. I think that the IDF or the Israeli government is not going to send them in unless they absolutely have to. But of course, there's only so much you can do from the air. I think at the point that the Israeli Air Force commanders decide they've dealt with all the terrorist targets they can from the air, that will be the time for the IDF to go in on the ground. And let's face it, once they're in there, they could be in there for a long time. And the reason I say that is because Hamas governs Gaza. The IDF have declared they're going to destroy Hamas in Gaza, whether by killing them or driving them out. And that leaves a vacuum, and it may have to be filled by an IDF government inside Gaza for a period of time.
Colonel Richard Kemp, stay safe there, and thanks for those insights, and we'll chat to you again soon. Thank you, Richard Kemp. Still to come, more on the landslide to the no campaign. It was you, the outsiders, who did it. The mainstream Australians, well done. You didn't listen to the elites. You didn't listen to the Qantas CEOs and all the rest of them. You listened to your own consciences. Well done. What's more coming up here on Outsiders? In a tick. Hello, you're watching Outsiders with Rita Panahi, with James Morrow and myself, Rowan Dean. The voice is dead. Woo-hoo! Mainstream Australia has resoundingly defeated this arrogant and undemocratic, out of touch Albanese government and their idea. The bureaucrats of Canberra who run and in many cases ruin our lives, who voted overwhelmingly for the voice, unlike every other state, have been shown to be completely out of touch with you, the everyday Australians. Our federation is not functioning properly. I'm the editor of The Spectator Australia. We were the only mainstream print publication to say no to the voice from the very get-go. I was contacted by a left-wing acquaintance of mine the other morning who said, "Rowan, I have never agreed with your stance on the ABC until now. They must be defunded." He went on, "While every international news service we looked at last weekend reported it for what it was, a murderous terrorist attack with indiscriminate and deliberate killing of civilians, the ABC reported it as a military operation by Hamas. Quote, Palestinian militants launch surprise assault. Israel strikes targets in Gaza, was the ABC headline at 6 p.m. on Saturday, October the 7th, as the rest of the world was reeling in horror at the terrorist murdering of women, babies and civilians. Listen to this disgusting reporting from our ABC, who said, renewed violence has broken out along Israel's volatile border with Gaza. Palestinian militants launched a surprise attack against Israel, prompting Israel's military to begin striking targets in the Gaza Strip. Now, let me tell you, what an abomination. As Khalid Abu Tomeh, an Israeli-Palestinian writer, wrote this week, quote, the indifference has reached a point where some Western media outlets and officials continue to label Hamas terrorists as militants. Yes, he's talking about you, ABC. The ABC then interviewed Nasser Mashni of the Australian Palestinian Advocacy Network. While the carcasses of the dead, raped and butchered women were still being paraded around the Gaza Strip. If this doesn't turn your stomach, I don't know what will.
Injustice towards Palestinians has driven conflict with Israel to this point. What injustice is he referring to?
Thanks firstly for having me on today. The injustice he's talking about is the fact that Palestinians have been subject to an Israeli war for 75 years, Miriam. For 75 years, day in and day out, the images that you've just shown have been occurring, but the victims have been Palestinians.
Oh, did you spot that classic moral inversion? Those images of butchered Israelis that have so appalled the world, miraculously transmogrified into the claimed butchery of Palestinians. Unbelievable. Now, watch as the ABC presenter loads up her next question.
What has led to this point in particular in recent times in terms of expanding settlements in the region and an escalating tension leading up to Saturday?
Well, if we just look at the past week, take yesterday out of context, just at the past week, we've had an Israeli minister, Smotrich, calling for an entire village to be wiped out. We've had 5 Palestinians killed, 4 by the army, 1 by a rampaging, pogrom-like settler group that had killed a Palestinian boy, a 16-year-old boy.
Whoa, hold on, pal. Wow. There's your moral inversion again. Hours after the worst murderous rampage by bloodthirsty butchers slaying Jews since the Holocaust, this bloke dares to co-opt the word pogrom. The word that, like Holocaust, is owned and defined by Jews because it is their history. As Rebecca Weiser writes in The Spectator Australia this week, the cover story there, of which I am the editor, as I said, quote, the organised massacres of Jews in 19th century Russia were called pogroms. Here's a description from the New York Times in 1903. The mob was led by priests, and the general cry, "Kill the Jews," was taken up all over the city. The Jews were taken wholly unaware and were slaughtered like sheep. Babies were literally torn to pieces by the frenzied and bloodthirsty mob. At sunset, the streets were piled with corpses and the wounded. So let's just be clear. You don't get to co-opt the word pogrom. Certainly not only hours after Hamas has inflicted a pogrom on the people of the Negev. But back to that interview.
The situation in Palestine is just horrific. This is Miriam, a day-by-day war by Israel on the Palestinians.
So there's that inversion again. Let's get a bit of objective perspective from our ABC presenter, shall we?
Can you talk to us about how it's evolved historically from the Palestinian perspective?
Well, from the Palestinian perspective, we were made to pay for the crimes of the Holocaust.
ABC fact-checkers, hello, anybody there? Obviously not.
As the president of the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, how do you feel hearing the Australian Prime Minister express his unequivocal support for Israel?
Look, I'm disappointed that there wasn't a mention at all of the thousands of Palestinians held captive by Israel.
There's that inversion all over again. This interview was a week ago today. The bodies were piling up, the horror was there. Oh, but let's see if our intrepid ABC journalist manages to link the atrocities being inflicted upon the Palestinians with, I don't know, The Voice.
Mr. Mashley, what do you make of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's comments a week before Australia is due to go to a referendum centred around reconciliation with our own Indigenous people? Do you draw any parallels?
Well, there are many parallels. Our Indigenous brothers and sisters here on this continent have been the subjects of brutal settler colonialism. Palestinians have suffered the same consequence, and we stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters here on this unceded Aboriginal land.
I'll leave you to find the vomit bucket for yourselves. Now, when this character's not dressing up in a smart suit for the ABC, here's what he's in his day job at a Melbourne rally. Listen carefully.
We as Palestinians know only too well the dispossession of an Indigenous people, and thank you. In particular, we'd also like to thank members of the Jewish community for standing here with us today. Thank you. Because these are real Jews, not the filth we've got over there.
Real Jews who support him and the filth over there who don't. But back to the ABC. Can we please put us out of their misery? The very first action on day one of a Dutton government must be to immediately transfer the ABC to a subscription model like Netflix or Spotify with no further taxpayer funding. If people want to watch that morally inverted and perverted garbage, let them pay out of their own pockets for it. I don't want to pay for any of that. But back to last weekend in Gaza. How do people become so bloodthirsty that they would engage in that sort of inhuman savagery and butchery? Well, I have one theory. For over a decade now, there's regularly been extremely disturbing reports surfacing out of Gaza showing school children as young as kindergarten being tutored by Hamas to hate and murder Jews. Back in 2013, the Times of Israel reported that, quote, video footage appears to show Palestinian children in summer camps run by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, that's UNRWA, being taught that Jews are the wolf and that they will one day conquer Israel's cities by force. Quote, UNRWA finances this summer camp. Amina Hinawi, director of that Gaza camp, said, I'm very, very, very appreciative of UNRWA. Then in 2016, the Jerusalem Post reported that over 200 US-approved textbooks reportedly to teach Palestinians to kill Jews, and that the violent curriculum can be found in 240 books, ranging from civics to mathematics, in over 400 UNRWA schools in the West Bank, Gaza and East Jerusalem. Even the Palestinian Chronicle admitted as recently as 2018, yes, Palestinians teach their children to hate the Jewish state. So the accusation has been that UNRWA, the United Nations agency, is in effect financing the murderous education with Western funds from countries including Australia. It's your money that is paying potentially to kill Jews, a concept that made the cover story of The Spectator Australia in March 2018 under the headline Aussie Tax Slayers, showing a Jewish man being stabbed by an Australian $100 note. Well, thanks to that story in The Spectator by Dr. David Adler of the Australian Jewish Association, along with his appearance here on Outsiders at this desk, with the invaluable help also in Parliament of Pauline Hanson, the then Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, agreed to halve Australia's funding from $20 million every year down to $10 million to UNRWA. Money that presumably, that saving of $10 million, she and others presumably feared was being used to finance scenes similar to this.
رغم النكبة التي أحلت به رافضا كل الوعودات الواهمة التي تغنى بها كل الحكام العرب.
You get the drift. There have also been scenes like this one from a Hamas Kids TV show broadcast in 2014.
لما يجي اليهود عنده يمسكوه
طبعا الجيران اليهوديين عادي
يطبش عليهم
لو كانوا يهود يعني جيران او صهاينه عادي وبتطخي اليهود صح؟ انت بدك تصيري زيه؟ ان شاء الله لما تكبري
لما تطخي اليهود
كلهم طيب.
Kids boasting about killing Jews. Little innocent children boasting about killing Jews. One of those UNRWA-financed teachers, Ella Mansour, wrote on Facebook that, by Allah, anyone who can kill and slaughter any Zionist and Israeli criminal and doesn't do so doesn't deserve to live. Kill them and pursue them everywhere. All Israel deserves is death. That was a teacher financed by UNRWA. More recently, films have shown scenes like this. Training kids to stone and try and kill Jews. Just last year, even the EU, the European Union, blasted UNRWA over reports that those funds, EU funds, were sponsoring terrorism. In July 2022, a report prepared by an Israeli NGO found that UNRWA's self-produced educational materials, self-produced note, promoted hatred, anti-Semitism and the celebration of terrorism, bloodshed and martyrdom. And now, to the Albanese government. Among the first things new Foreign Minister Penny Wong did last year was she announced that she was reinstating the cancelled $10 million per annum back to UNRWA. Penny Wong also announced that the Albanese government was reinstating the term occupied Palestinian territories to describe not only disputed parts of Israel, but such as the West Bank and settlements, but also East Jerusalem. This announcement was greeted rapturously around the Middle East. And finally, Penny Wong announced that the Albanese government was reversing the Morrison government's recognition of West Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Stick those three things together, and I'd say you've guaranteed yourself a spot on the Hamas Christmas card list, that's for sure. So what makes people as brutal and savage as we saw last weekend? This video on the Australian Jewish Association website from several years ago, sourced from the Centre for Near East Policy Research, well, it's sickening. Watch.
We found that Hamas was recruiting and exploiting 17,000 young teens. Drafted from UNRWA by Hamas, the teens attend war games where they learn how to use lethal weapons.
فإن الجنود الأشداء قادمون بإذن الله عز وجل سوف يرونه في حيفا وتل أبيب وكل مكان من أرضنا الفلسطينية.
إحنا بنعد ونتدرب في هذه المخيمات كي نصبح مجاهدون ونقاوم الاحتلال الإسرائيلي.
تعلمنا كثير في هذه المخيمات زي تفكيك السلاح الأجزاء المعينة فيه وخشينا هذه كمان المخيمات إحنا حتى ننهي العدوان الصهيوني من هذه البلد ونصل الأرض المحتلة القدس ونحررها بإذن الله.
المقاومة تعتبرها حماس أساً لإرجاع الأرض وتحرير العرض وتحرير الأبناء وإقامة الدولة وعاصمتها القدس.
Yes, Hamas repeatedly states its goal is a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. But what happens to all the Jews, you may ask? Well, let's ask the kids.
أصبح مجاهد مقاتل في سبيل الله ولنحرر فلسطين من دنس الاحتلال الصهاينة ولنكون نواة مشروع التحرير القادم بإذن الله.
That's what's happening with Palestinian youth and has been happening for years. But it gets even more disturbing when you realise who is financing all this. Yes, UNRWA. Yes, the same mob that Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese restored $10 million of your funding to that.
طبيعة العلاقة بين حماس والأونروا هي علاقة طيبة وجيدة. نحن نحرص على تسهيل وتيسير أعمال الأونروا ويحدث تواصل في بعض الأمور التي قد يحتاجون.
And finally, let's hear from Pakistani ambassador to the UN, Zaman Mehdi, speaking for the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation last week.
On behalf of the OIC member states, we express our deep concerns over the loss of innocent lives in the occupied Palestinian territory and elsewhere. Regrettably, this huge loss of lives and unabated violence is a sad reminder of more than 7 decades of illegal foreign occupation.
So there you have it. That was followed by a moment's silence, not for the murdered babies, not for the raped women, not for the mutilated and enslaved children and men slaughtered by Hamas, but for the loss of life in the occupied Palestinian territory. Where have I heard that phrase before? Oh, yes. That's what Penny Wong officially re-designated large parts of Israel as on Australian terminology, the occupied Palestinian territory. Oh, and what happens when those kids being taught in those UNRWA-financed schools to hate and murder Jews all grow up? Kids whose Jew hatred may well have been learned in schools partially funded by Australian taxpayers. Well, this bit of online footage surfaced in 2018, was presumably filmed in Gaza in or before 2017. Just a harmless school play, perhaps?
انت الفجر في نظرتك اصحاب الارض لحم العرض.
Those young boys by now would probably be young adult males. I wonder how they spent last weekend. And finally, have a listen to this incredibly brave Palestinian man from Gaza dropping truth bombs at the UN back in 2017. He used to belong to Hamas. He is from Gaza. Here he is addressing the United Nations General Assembly. And look at the looks of horror on the faces of the official Palestinian delegates.
This is evidenced by your own total violation for their human rights. In fact, the Palestinian individual and their human development is the least of your concerns. You kidnap Palestinian students from campus and torture them in your jails. You torture your political rivals. The suffering of the Palestinian people is the outcome of your selfish political interest. You are the greatest enemy of the Palestinian people. If Israel did not exist, you would have no one to blame. Take responsibility for the outcome of your own actions. You fan the flames of conflict to maintain your abusive power. Finally, you use this platform to mislead the international community, to mislead the Palestinian society, to believe that Israel is responsible for the problem you create.
Let's turn back to The Voice now and the thumping loss to the Yes campaign. All 6 states voting no to Albanese's divisive, lazy, futile referendum. And today, Labor has a hell of a lot to answer for. Joining us to discuss this is Nationals MP Keith Pitt. Keith, great to see you. As always, you were one of those who were opposing The Voice right up front. We've already congratulated your colleague, Bridget McKenzie, and I congratulate you too. Keith Pitt, you fought all along against this insane idea. Congratulations to you. But what does it mean politically now for Labor?
Well, firstly, it's great to be with you. Secondly, I'm actually quite saddened. The fact that someone would look to divide the country intentionally, and that it's the nation's Prime Minister, it's federal Labor government, and basically a bunch of activists from capital cities, well, it just makes me sad. But secondly, I'm heartened by the fact that you can still stand for your convictions. You can actually stand up, put forward your proposition, you can make your case to the Australian people, and if they agree with you, they will go with you. And no one should underestimate that this was actually quite difficult. All of the research said 60% plus, they'll support yes, you can't possibly vote no. Well, the proposition was wrong. It was one that we didn't support. We're out on early, and here in my electorate, at the moment, we're the third biggest no vote in the country, as are a lot of Queensland. And, mate, I'll just make one more quick point. I was in a pharmacist this morning, and I had a lady come over and said, "Are you Keith Pitt?" And I said, "Yes." And you usually know where this stuff's going. And she said, "Well, I suppose you're happy." And I said, "Well, same as I've just said, I'm actually quite saddened by the division in the nation." And she said, "Well, I'm a hardcore lefty, and I'm married to an Aboriginal man, and I couldn't bring myself to vote for this."
Wow.
And how about Labor just starts listening to the local people on the cashless debit card, on not getting rid of alcohol bans, on making sure we get kids to school? How about they listen to some of those voices?
Exactly, and Jacinta Price was, of course, at the front of those. Rita?
Well, we are seeing the no vote prevail, not only in Linda Burney's own seat, but a number of Labor ministers' seats. Energy Minister Chris Bowen, Education Minister Jason Clare, Tony Burke, Ed Husick, the list goes on. What does that say about the Labor Party being out of touch with their own voters? How could Linda Burney's own seat vote against this?
Well, I think it's just a demonstration, firstly, of their judgment, and secondly, that the mob will always work you out. I mean, it's a well-known fact. It's been around for a long time, and you can't pull the wool over their eyes. They desperately wanted detail. It wasn't provided. They want to know what difference it would make, and clearly it was none unless you lived in the cities and you were likely to be put on this thing and potentially paid who knows how much, because no one said. I mean, politically, I still don't know that this will have a direct impact on Labor's primary. I think the Australian people will sort of, dust their hands and say, well, we've dealt with that issue, and let's get back to what really matters, and that's cost of living. We just can't afford to pay our bills, and I think if they're going to come unstuck at the federal level, Labor will come unstuck on that because they just keep driving prices up.
James.
Well, Keith, it's right to have a conversation about Labor and where they go with this. I know some people are saying that Albanese's leadership is in doubt. I'm with you. I think that people are going to move on from this reasonably quickly politically. But what about on the coalition side of things? Because, there were an awful lot of people on the coalition, including state national parties and others, who did not back in the no case and did, in many ways, certainly in New South Wales, an awful lot to stymie the no campaign. Does there have to be a reckoning within the parties of the centre-right and the coalition?
Oh, well, I think that's probably right. And that reckoning comes from the membership. It's why people are members of political parties. And in Queensland, I can only speak for the Queensland LNP, we're a democratic party. The members decide whether you get put up for pre-selection or not, and we get put forward every single time that we want to stand. And if the members decide that your judgment's incorrect, well, they'll move you on. And I think there's some potential for that for sure. But what a great thing for our democracy. People can have a different view and they can put it forward and the Australian people work it out.
Well, I don't think you need to be sad. I think you should be jubilant that the Australian people faced up to this overwhelming campaign of bullying and guilt and misinformation from the Yes camp and said no. I think that is a triumph for everyday Australians. But I am interested in Andrew G. He resigned from the Nationals, sits now as an independent because he backed The Voice. His seat voted something like 70% no. So is there something wrong with our democracy when we've got someone sitting in Parliament not representing the party that got him elected and seemingly not representing the people in his own electorate?
Rita, don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely heartened for our democracy and the fact the Australian people won't be fooled. And I think in Calare, I think Andrew G's in more trouble than Flash Gordon. And I think they won't forget, and I'm confident that will probably continue to remind them of who made what decision
I think there's a much...
And he was elected.
But I'd have to disagree with both James and you, Keith. I think Anthony Albanese is politically dead man walking. I cannot see how you can be the Prime Minister who the first thing he did when he was elected, he said he was going to be doing this thing. It's his signature policy. He spent 18 months on this thing, Keith, while the Australian people have got poorer and poorer because of the lie he told about electricity bills. This government has no legitimacy. I can't believe the unions are going to sit there, or the Labor Party are going to sit there and back this guy through to the next election. As I say, I think he's politically dead man walking. He has nothing to offer the Australian people, and that is crystal clear. Keith, just very quickly before you go, so many Australians were too terrified to even, put on a no T-shirt or put a no poster up outside their sign. This is something we've never seen before in Australia. This was intimidation of the everyday Australians by the elites and by the left. The Nationals led the way, but, we've got to make sure this never happens again, Keith.
I agree. The only thing that'd be worse for Labor was if they're Rudd Gillard Rudd again, so I think there's that. But secondly, it was my colleagues in the National Party, and there were a fairly small crew of us to start with.
Exactly.
That managed to till the ground, drove it forward. Myself, Jacinta Price, obviously, Barnaby, Lou O'Brien, Dave Gillespie, Cole Boyce. We made a decision very early that this was a values-based decision. You don't split the country. Everyone gets an equal say in our democracy, and I'm absolutely heartened that the Australian people listen to that message. And I think it is a great day for democracy, even though I'm sad about the division that it's caused. And it's up to all of us now. We've got to put the place back together and get on with what needs to be done.
Fantastic. Keith Pitt, you were an absolute warrior throughout this, and you've spoken to us many times here on Outsiders. Thanks so much. It is a big day. Crack a few cold ones up there in Queensland for us and in your electorate as well. Thanks, mate. Coming up, Quanta Ahmed gives us her perspective on, as a Muslim woman, what is happening in Israel and Gaza. Plus, James's donkey vote in a tick.
Hello, you're watching Outsiders. I'm James Morrow here with Rowan Referendum Dean and Rita First Past the Post Panahi as we continue to mark this historic occasion where the voice referendum has gone down in a heap. Now, we're going to be talking a lot more about that as well as the latest out of Gaza. But first, sometimes I'm not sure what is scarier. The fact that the world is coming apart at the seams, or the fact that the man who is supposed to be leading Western civilization through the turmoil is also, well, coming apart at the seams. Speaking in Philadelphia Friday, Joe Biden had yet another one of his close encounters of the stairs kind. This time, when he attempted to mount a small riser to give a speech on how Bidenomics is contributing to a stronger America. Have a look at this. Yikes, good recovery there, sir. Let's have a look at this from another angle and note that this stumble was preceded by that little jog he likes to do to show how vigorous he is. Anyway, as a metaphor for Bidenomics and pretty much everything else this White House touches, well, I think that vision kind of says it all because, yes, to its great credit, the administration has said and done most of the right things since Hamas's psychotic pits of hell terrorist attack on southern Israel. But it has steamed naval assets into the eastern Mediterranean, prioritized military supplies, and Joe Biden was out of the box early with comments supportive of Israel. Yet at the same time, and here's where the problem comes in, there is no escaping these facts either. One, Iran is Hamas's #1 source of support. And indeed, the U.S. government has conceded that Hamas, if it weren't for Iran's backing, wouldn't exist. Now, two, this is a disturbing bit, the United States under Joe Biden has gone out of its way to rehabilitate Tehran, give it money, and allow it to earn foreign currency by selling millions of barrels of oil, even putting it on the path to possessing a nuclear weapon of its very own. Look here at Secretary of State Anthony Blinken trying to justify one part of the piece of the program to enrich Iran, the unfreezing of $6 billion, which the administration finally, after pressure, turned around just earlier.
When it comes to $6 billion, it's important to be very clear because, unfortunately, some people are either misinformed or they're misinforming. The money in question, Iranian money, not American taxpayer dollars, is money that was allowed to accrue in a bank account from the sale of Iranian oil. What we did is we moved the money from one account in South Korea to another account in Qatar where the money could actually be used, but under the supervision of our Treasury Department, only for humanitarian purposes, and not a dollar of that money has been spent to date. And we retain the right to freeze that account.
Now, note, of course, he doesn't mention all the other money Iran has been allowed to earn, or the fact that funds that are freed up for humanitarian purposes, so-called, are also freeing up funds that can then be used for things like, well, Hamas butchering sprees. And here's the line White House spokesman John Kirby tried to take to sidestep the question of what happens to Iranian money and why the U.S. won't simply say, no, you have not getting this money.
Why is it that you won't come out and say that the U.S. does not intend to let this money go to Iran?
Jackie, we've always had, since the beginning, we've always had the ability to provide oversight over the disbursement of these funds. We've always had the option, if we wanted it, to look at transactions and to make a call about whether we found it valid or not. That has not changed. And even now, as you and I are speaking, none of that money has been accessed by anybody. It's still all there.
Now, this is just gibbering from John Kirby. It doesn't make any sense. And it's only after Republicans and the media and the world put pressure on the White House that they said, all right, fine, you can't get the $6 billion just yet. But there's a lot of reasons why I think this dance is going on. Now, one part of it comes back to the fundamental shift that happened in the United States under Barack Obama, when Iran became America's privileged partner in the Middle East over Israel. But a second part of this is a practical problem that the administration has created for itself. Namely, it's this. By strengthening Iran and weakening America, both deliberately, I might add, the Democrats have now given Iran the whip hand over the United States, and they can now threaten to rerun the strategic and oil crises that made the 1970s such a nightmare. Remember that? I'm showing my age here remembering those gas prices, but it gets worse. At the same time as the Biden administration has been handing billions of dollars to Iran and letting them pump oil again, they also have let the American Strategic Petroleum Reserve run down to a 17-day supply. And because of the geology of the underground caverns where that fuel lives, or used to live, it will be almost impossible to fill those stores back up again. And the Biden administration has also done everything it can to make it impossible for oil companies to drill for new oil in the U.S., destroying the energy independence America had under Trump. This means that America's enemies can strike as well as their terrorist evil, an inflationary dagger at the heart of the American economy going into the election year, cutting production and spiking prices, making life all that more difficult for Americans, while filling the coffers of the mullahs in Iran and Vladimir Putin in Moscow. At this rate, then, we're all going to wind up, well, just as lost as Joe Biden.
Well, as Hamas has inflicted incomprehensible terror on the Israeli people, our next guest, a Muslim woman, wants it known that Hamas is not a military, Hamas is not an army, but in fact Hamas are terrorists. Hamas is ISIS. and they are exploiting the Palestinian people. Independent Women's Forum fellow and Muslim scholar Dr. Quanta Ahmed joins us now. Quanta, great to see you as always. As a Muslim, we're seeing here in Australia, even today, demonstrations, anti-Israeli demonstrations. We've had some horrific scenes that went all around the world on the steps of the Opera House, people yelling, gas the Jews, kill the Jews, F the Jews. As a proud Muslim, what do you say about the events of last week?
I think, Rowan, that's the best word I've heard this week, incomprehensible. Just to try and understand the scale, people are using the comparison with 9/11 that we lived through here in New York. This is so much bigger than 9/11. This is equivalent to the United States losing almost 50,000 people to Islamist jihadists. The fact that it was targeting the Jewish people, it was explicit Islamist anti-Semitism, the brutality, the bestiality, the images exceed a lot of what I have seen related to ISIS. Those images were broadcast. We're now all recipients of psychological warfare waged on the state of Israel, waged on the Jewish people. It is, the words just cannot capture the horror. And as a Muslim, I am extremely fearful that this is going to reanimate international Islamist jihadism. There's already been calls by Khalid Mishal for global jihad, and social media, according to Rilla Global, shows 1.5 million calls on social media in the first week, calls to action, including in the United States, the UK, the Netherlands, France, Rotterdam being a particular epicenter. This is extremely dangerous for the state of Israel and for the Muslim world.
James.
So, Quanta, where does this go in terms of the Muslim world? Because obviously Iran backs Hamas and Hezbollah. Israel had been getting close to the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, which, of course, annoyed Iran. Where do the Saudis and the Gulf states go? Are they going to be forced to pick a side now? And will the Muslim world once again wind up being where it was a few decades ago, i.e., again united against Israel? There'll be a tragic outcome, but is that where we're going?
Well, first of all, I'm very glad that the United Arab Emirates, that's party to the Abraham Accords, and Bahrain have condemned the atrocities committed on the Israeli people. I think Saudi Arabia has announced a pause. This is not time to advance negotiations, but I do not believe it is going to retreat. Saudi Arabia particularly has invested trillions in elevating its population very effectively. They do not want to go back to pre-9/11 jihadist ideology. But the Arab world, the Muslim world, myself as a Muslim, extremely concerned about the plight and suffering of the Palestinian people as well as the Israeli people, and we need to come up with some real solutions. Pressure is on to create humanitarian corridor. Egypt has a critical role in that, but Egypt also needs to have guarantees that it's not going to be overrun by Hamas Islamists. Egypt works with Israel to secure and prevent Hamas from gaining a foothold, and the Egyptian people have kicked out Islamist ideology from Egypt in the Muslim Brotherhood, as has Saudi Arabia. So I certainly am anxious to hear Muslim leaders around the world, Muslim rulers, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the head of the Muslim World League, Dr. Mohammed Al-Issa. I want them to condemn Hamas and acknowledge that Hamas is not the legitimate voice of the Palestinian people. Remember, Hamas has not permitted elections. Hamas went to civil war with Fatah, the other Palestinian authority that's now in the West Bank. Hamas is illegitimate. And at this moment, we are on the threshold of a war that Israel is going to wage on the ground in Gaza, which is going to be as difficult as the battle for Mosul, the battle for Fallujah. It is going to be absolutely devastating and difficult, but Israel will prevail. Hamas does not have the capability to defeat Israel, and Israel has to be emphatic. Israel's response to this is a pure deterrent so that Hezbollah understands it cannot get involved. That would be cataclysmal, and this is what Israel is also waging.
If Hamas is defeated, are we going to have another extremist, Islamist, terrorist group fill that void?
I would say, first of all, the word choice is excellent, Rita. We do want to see Hamas defeated and not destroyed. Destroyed means reconstitution. Defeat of Hamas is essential. If the circumstances of the Palestinian people do not change, that is going to lead to further similar conflicts, perhaps in related areas. So while a military solution is now imperative, without a political solution, that indeed could be a futile exercise. And so these are the questions that international leaders are thinking about, and that will need engagement of the surrounding Muslim Arab world. There were many opportunities in previous decades to formulate a sovereign Palestinian state in parallel to Israel. Many of us still hope for a two-state solution. That cannot happen if there is an armed Islamist state fueled by petrodollars on your doorstep. That is never going to happen. And so these are very difficult questions that are being contemplated.
Dr. Quanta Ahmed, always great to chat to you. Thanks so much for coming on here on Outsiders, and stay safe there in the States, and we'll chat again soon. Coming up, very special guest here in the studio, Professor Plimer in a tick. You're watching Outsiders, and normally we do Ice Age Watch Now, but we're just going to put it on hold for this week. We have a very special guest in the studio, Professor Ian Plimer. Great to see you, Ian. Always welcome here on Outsiders. Now, I want to ask you first about The Voice. You spend a lot of time in outback Australia, where mining, exploratory mining areas. You know the outback incredibly well. You always predicted that this voice thing would never pass muster. What's your reaction to the result?
Well, it was very interesting to see Queensland, Northern Territory, South Australia and Western Australia, where there was a significant outback Aboriginal population, and all those states and territories were above 60%. So it's telling us something very fundamental, that we have a huge divide in this country, and it's between very, very wealthy people living in inner-city areas and those who are actually creating the new wealth, such as those in rural Australia. And for the mining and exploration industry, if treaties go ahead, then you might as well say goodbye to mining in Australia. The Woodside example is probably the best one of the lot.
And Ian, I mean, just thinking about those results, you know, you do see where The Voice was really successful. It was in those sort of seats that are predominated by people who are involved with corporate Australia, not the mining and productive industries, but maybe some of the less productive sort of parts of the economy. What do you make of the fact that we were just discussing how in the Republic referendum and in this referendum, those same seats all kind of went the same way, and that it's almost a geographic and class thing versus almost whatever else the policy is that's being put up?
Very much so. And people living in those Peel seats and some of the other inner city seats, they might go on a wine tasting trip to Mudgee. And they think they're going outback. Look, I can tell you that on a quiet day you can hear the surf in Mudgee. You know, I mean, that's how close to the coast are. These people have never been in the bush. They would not know how to change a tyre. They wouldn't know how to fix a problem. I've seen them in the outback. They get to the end of a sealed road and there's a dirt road there and they're all debating it. Oh, should
the electric vehicle won't go down.
And then they turn around and go back. I mean, it's just amazing.
Ian,
just want to have no idea.
Just want to go back to you mentioned Woodside. Now, tell us about that specifically. Rita and James and I have a thing called Instant Karma, and we played the Woodside episode last week for Instant Karma because the board of Woodside came out heavily for the yes, but then what happened?
Well, I think it was a window for the average punter saying, wait a minute, this is the way it's going to go. And this is going to stop development. Now, Woodside was right over the horizon, out to sea. And there was trawling done to find one person who might have some sort of objection to this. And people saw, well, what a farce this is. Now, the Woodside board, like many other boards, were very, very woke. And I think shareholders, quite rightfully, should be asking serious questions, firstly about any monies donated, and secondly, why the board got involved in politics and took these sort of decisions.
But what then happened to Woodside? That's what I'm saying. What happened to them?
Well, with Woodside, they have to go back to the drawing board.
Because?
Because of one person who was sued on by the Environmental Defenders Office, which taxpayers pay for, to fight the federal government. So you had one government organisation fighting another, taxpayers paying for both, to stop a seismic survey.
And it was on Indigenous grounds or on Aboriginal reasons?
It was way out to sea.
Yes, but that was the argument, wasn't it?
Well, the argument is fallacious, of course. Now, you can put wind turbines out to sea and do similar sort of seismic surveys. That's OK. But if you're looking for fossil fuels, which not only fuel up your car, but they make medicines, they're used to make plastics, they're used to make fertilisers. If we don't have that, we don't eat. Apparently that's bad. So you've got this tortured logic by people who are really quite evil because they want to destroy jobs in Australia.
Rita? Sorry.
Well, and this is happening without a voice in the Constitution.
Of course.
So how do we actually remedy that? We've stopped the voice, thank God, but how do we fix a problem that's already evident? Because this Woodside decision isn't in isolation. There's quite a few others where you can say these aren't logical decisions, where we had a project that was stopped because it might disrupt a serpent, and not a real serpent, a mythical one, yes, a mythical serpent.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's quite common. I know one project where there's two exploration areas that are being amalgamated into one, and they have to go back and do all the land surveys again. And all that means is paying someone $800 a day to stagger around and look for a little chip here and a little chip there. This is just a financial rort. And the activists who had everything financially to gain from this really have to be pushed aside and to put in the new great Aboriginal generation of people like Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine. We cannot have those failed activists continuing on the same path. And this is the danger with The Voice now.
Now, tell us about those outback communities, because Warren and Jacinta have both, talked about them and spent time out there. You've spent time out there. Isn't the problem that they're living in these kind of communist fiefdoms, which individuals don't have property rights? You have the big man who runs the show and gets the money and spreads it. All that has to change, hasn't it?
Yes, it does. And no wonder the ACT vote went as it was, because these are the people who are running the show, who've got the most to benefit, who will expand their government departments with your money to continue what is a disaster. Now, these outback areas, these kids don't get schooling. They can't get schooling. They quite often can't go home. Drugs and alcohol are rife. Sexual destruction of young children is happening for kids from 8 years old, even younger. So there has to be a fundamental change. This cannot be driven by Canberra unless, of course, you shift the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and put them, say, in Halls Creek. Or in Tennant Creek.
I think that's a great idea.
And then they'll be at the coalface.
Fantastic. And let's get Prime Minister Jacinta Price to start running some things in the future.
Well,
I think we would see a big difference there. Professor Ian Plimer, thanks so much for coming here on Outsiders, talking to us about The Voice. Don't go anywhere. More Outsiders after this break in a tick. Well, hyperbole, extreme exaggeration. There's plenty of that from the Yes campaign for the last 18 months and the Albanese government. But let's have a quick look at this Australian-Palestinian woman responding to the events, the horrific events of last weekend.
We go now to Asala Sayara, a Palestinian activist who was one of the organisers of the rally last night. Asala, welcome. Last night was quite a night. How is the Palestinian community feeling today?
Hello, Davina. I guess if I want to express how we are feeling in one word, it will be very hard. I would say it's bittersweet. We are feeling a mix of emotions. We are feeling angry. We are feeling saddened with the pain and the suffering that we Palestinians have been facing until this day. A injustice at the hands of the Israeli occupation. But on the other hand, we are also feeling proud of the resilience and the resistance of the Palestinian people.
That's an Australian, Rita. That's an Australian woman, Rita. We had butchered babies, raped women.
That's resistance, apparently, is it? Is that what
bittersweet
is? Bittersweet.
Sorry, I didn't notice any sort of condemnation there from her about the actual suffering of the Israelis on the ground
who'd just been slaughtered, and
butchered.
there were hostages who are still, God knows what's happening to them. One of the bits of footage that I've seen this week that was the most harrowing wasn't of the violence. It was an interview with a father who had lost his 8-year-old daughter. she'd been missing for a couple of days, and they called and said, "We found her. She's dead." And he said he was so happy because the alternative was so much worse, that if she was taken a hostage and was being tortured in Gaza. So this father, this broken man who was happy to hear his daughter was dead because the alternative was too horrific to bear. I mean, that is what we're dealing with.
That's what we're dealing with.
Bittersweet, ain't it?
Disgusting. Well, also in Ireland, this was a Lush store. Lush are those stores, that disgusting smell when you walk through they're revolting. I can't stand the smell of them. Well, the stench goes right to the top at Lush, let me tell you. They put a sign up saying boycott Israel. I'd say to anyone in Australia, don't go near those shops. They are horrible. The stench, as I said, is enough to warn you and put you off. Shame on Lush. What a disgrace. Let's also just quickly... James, you wanted to mention?
Oh, well, just we've had now news that the repatriation flights to bring Australians back have been put on hold because of the deteriorating security situation on the ground now. I mean, obviously, people have to make their own assessments of the airlines. The government has to make their assessments. I do note, though, that the government, went to great lengths to mount operations in 2022 to bring back ISIS brides who had voluntarily married into ISIS from Syrian refugee camps. But anyway, I'll just leave that there.
And Rowan, the families, some of them are making their own arrangements, those who can, to get their loved ones out of there. But I've heard from parents who are getting all these questions from DFAT, like the COVID vaccination status of their kid before they... Really, DFAT? Is that really imperative information to know right now?
No, it's a disgrace. Now, just very quickly, last thing on The Voice, have a look at this clip. It's not about The Voice, but it's very similar in the States. This is Bill Maher. Have a quick look.
To all the people who start every public event now with one of those land acknowledgements where they say, I'm standing on land that was stolen from the proud indigenous people of the Chumash tribe, I say either give it back or shut up.
And that's it for Outsiders. Couldn't have put it better ourselves. We'll see you next Sunday morning at 9 a.m. The No Vote won thanks to you, the Outsiders of Australia. Thank you so much. See you next week.